Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to my channel. I'm working on an Orcs and Goblins army for Warhammer the Old World, and I want to paint a few stone trolls for it. Let's paint these up fast using contrast paints and a few tricks. I started off by priming the models with my favorite method, beginning with a coat of gray primer all over, followed by a light dusting of white spray from the top and sides. Contrast paints are the most effective when we start with the lightest areas first, and in this case it's going to be the bellies. I'm beginning with a mix of about 4 parts Apothecary White contrast paint and 1 part Stormvermin fur. Apothecary White is too cool and too light for the trolls, but by mixing in a warm gray like Stormvermin fur, it brings the color much closer to how I want it. Working on one section at a time, begin by flooding the area with paint. Then wipe your brush on a paper towel and soak up the excess. Large, flat areas can be tricky with contrast paint, and I want to make sure it stays smooth. I rinsed the brush a couple times and soaked up extra paint from the top section. With a little practice and the right touch, you can get a pretty smooth result. The zenithal prime also shows through the areas we wiped off, and it effectively gives us a highlight. I also painted the undersides of the arms and the inside of the ears. We'll leave those areas and then move on to the blue skin and scales with Space Wolves Gray. Just like the last layer, work on one section at a time and begin with a generous coat of paint to ensure it makes its way into all the recesses. We don't want the paint to drip or pool, so wipe the brush on a paper towel and soak up any excess paint as needed. We'll be using a blending technique on the areas where it meets up with the light gray skin, and it's really easy. Paint a small section, then rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then run the clean brush along the edge to blend and soften the transition. Work your way around the model until all the skin and scales are painted. Next, we're going to darken the skin some more using Ultramarines blue, focusing mostly on the scales. I'm using the blending technique a lot more with this color. Paint a small section at a time, then rinse the brush, dry it off on a paper towel, and then run the clean brush along the edge to blend it. You may have to rinse and repeat a couple times to get a smooth blend. Once you're happy with the blend, look for any areas where the paint is pooling and soak it up with the brush. Work all around the model, allowing more of the blue to accumulate on the scales, and use the blending technique to create some subtle halftones on the arms. Now is a great time to ask you to do all those YouTube things we all love so much. Please click the like button if you're liking the video so far. It really helps out the channel. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so yet. That way you don't miss out on any future content. Next, I'm going to dry brush the scales with Russ Gray. Grab some paint on the brush and wipe off nearly all of it on a paper towel. Use plenty of pressure and circular motions. I like to dry brush in a variety of directions, sometimes circular and sometimes side to side. The more directions you go, the smoother the end result will be. One thing I've noticed is when I include dry brushing in a video, I get a lot of comments about brushes. I'm using an old, cheap craft brush here. There are lots of specialty dry brushes on the market, and they can be very useful, so if you have one, by all means use it. There are drawbacks to using a cheap brush, of course, but I want to make sure my guides are as accessible as possible, and show that you can still get good results from inexpensive materials. I dry brushed one more highlight with Fenrisian Gray, focusing just on the scales. You could use a detail brush and paint all the edges if you like, but since this will be for a large army, I'm okay with saving time and dry brushing it. You may notice that some paint from the previous stages has spilled over on the unpainted areas. That's okay, since we'll be using opaque paints for those sections. We'll start off by painting the bones and teeth with Bonewhite. Then I painted a highlight with Offwhite. I used a fine brush on the smaller details like the teeth and painted over most of them. On the larger areas, I switched to a bigger brush and applied the paint kind of like a heavy dry brush. Next I painted the claws with Zandri dust. Then I shaded the bones and claws with Skeleton Horde. I don't want the shade to be too dark on the bones and teeth, so after painting those areas I rinsed the brush, dried it off on a paper towel, and then wiped off the shade from the raised areas. It kind of works like an easy highlight. Next I base coated the wood with Steel Legion Drab. Then I shaded the wood with a mix of equal parts Nuln oil and Agrax Earthshade. This is a really useful mix that I find myself using a lot. I'd recommend mixing up a whole pot of it. Check out this video here to see how I go about mixing up a custom color. Now let's move on to the stone. I base coated all the stone areas with Dawnstone, as well as the ropes on this club. Some of the other stone parts have crystals sculpted on them, and I went ahead and painted those Dawnstone as well. Next it's time to make some texture, so I dry brushed and stippled the stones with white and an old brush. Make some side-to-side strokes and some tapping and jabbing marks as well. The goal here is to make a bunch of white scratches. It looks a little rough now, but we're going to add some washes next, and they'll get toned down. To shade the stone, I'm using a mix of equal parts Nuln oil and Apothecary white. and I also put down some Agrax Earthshade in a separate well of my palette. Grab some of the gray mix and paint it over the stone, then get some Earthshade and paint some in a few spots. You can make some stippling marks as well for extra texture. The more random you can make it, the better it will look. If you get too much paint on the model, you can soak it up with the brush. I painted the crystals the same way, except I tried to keep the paint smooth on those areas. After the shades were dry, I went back with Agrax Earthshade and painted a thin layer in a few areas, making sure to avoid the crystals, just to add more variety of tones and make the stone look more natural. Next I painted the crystals in 2 stages, using Black Lotus from Vallejo Xpress color. This color is more like a dark blue, and it can look really cool when layered over other colors. I'm starting out with a thin layer, almost like a glaze. I don't want the paint to pool very much, if at all. The goal with this coat is to tint all the colors underneath it. With the first layer dry, now we're going to apply a second, along with some blending. Work on one facet at a time, and paint a small amount on one side of it. Then rinse the brush, dry it off on a paper towel, and use the clean brush to blend out the edge. Work all the way around, and you can apply a second coat if you want to deepen the color. Next I painted the rope with Black Templar. Then I base coated all the straps and loincloths with Doombull brown. You may need to apply a second coat for an even finish. Even though the leather has been base coated with just one color, we can end up getting 2 different tones by using 2 different shade paints. I want the loincloths to be a very dark brown, and Wyldwood will do the trick. Contrast paints work great over darker base coats, just as well as light colors. They'll just end up a lot darker. Apply the paint in the same manner as you normally would. Put down plenty of paint so it reaches all the crevices, and then soak up any extra paint with the brush. Then I shaded the other leather areas with Agrax Earthshade. Next I painted the eyes, beginning with a coat of black. Mistakes happen sometimes, and Russ Gray was a close match, so it was easy to fix. Then I painted the eyes with toxic yellow, making sure to leave a thin black outline. I painted the pupils with black, and then I added a tiny dot of white in the larger eye. At this stage you could base the models and call them done. However, I'd like to add a few highlights to bring them up to the next level. Since this is for a gaming army, I'm not going to go too crazy on them, but a few well-placed highlights can really elevate a model with minimal effort. I highlighted the wood with Baneblade brown, just a few of the edges and corners to accent the wood grain. Then I highlighted the edges of the darker leather with Mournfang brown. Next I highlighted the other leather with Tuskgor fur. With some slightly thinned Bonewhite, I picked out the edges of the claws. Then I made a few highlights along the teeth with Offwhite. If you need to do any touch-ups on the belly, Grey Sear is a good starting point. It worked out perfect on its own here, but depending on how light or dark your zenithal prime is, you may need to adjust the color a bit. Try mixing in some white or Stormvermin fur if it needs to be lighter or darker. I used a very small amount of white paint and added a few reflections on the crystals. Finally, and probably the most important part, I painted some highlights on the faces with Fenrisian Grey. You could highlight all the scales as well, but since this is for a gaming army, I'm going to just stick with the faces. Otherwise, they'll never get done. I used an old brush to apply wood glue to the bases. Then I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the glue dried, I painted the sand with thinned Rhinox hide, followed by a dry brush of Steel Legion Drab. I base coated the rocks with Dawnstone, and then washed them with Agrax Earthshade. I painted the edge of the base with Rhinox hide, and then applied patches of static grass with superglue. These trolls were a nice change of pace from the other stuff I've been painting lately. Sometimes it's nice to just dry brush models and call them finished, and not have to worry too much about the fine details. I have a lot of other models for my Orcs and Goblins army, and they'll probably get similar treatment. Are you interested in more old world content? What armies would you like to see on the channel? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.